Morning people, we're going to go on a big journey with this video. This video will be the most important video you ever watch. First of all, I have to say that this video is for entertainment purposes only. Any names that I mention are purely coincidental, and I don't endorse any political party or independent, and I don't support any particular side of politics. I just tell it the way it is. So today we're going to cover in this video the most important election in the history of the world, which, believe it or not, is the Victorian election coming up in 2 weeks, where people can actually start pre-polling from tomorrow. We're also going to cover the union movement, the leadership of the union movement. We are going to cover the World Economic Forum in Melbourne in 2000. We are going to cover how you know that you live in a fascist dictatorship and what you can do about it, and touching on the Victorian election. The whole world is watching, and when I say the whole world, I mean the powers that be are watching the result of this election, and we'll get into the reasons why and how important the way Victorians vote in 2 weeks is going to change what the powers that be have planned for us. So stay tuned and we'll get stuck into it in just 1 minute. Okay, so let's start off with a conspiracy theorist. What is a conspiracy theorist, and why is there so many conspiracy theorists that have popped up in the last 2 years? Well, for most of us, that's not hard to understand why. But there's three types of conspiracy theorists. There's the conspiracy theorist that's been piecing patterns together for many, many years, 20, 30, 40 years. And these patterns are social, economic, religious. They appear and resolve themselves in education, religion, and many other areas. And those that have got a cynical mind, they'll see these patterns, and then they're able to orate these patterns and predict what is going to happen in the future, or call out what's happening in the present. Then there's the quiet cynic, and every family has got a quiet cynic. They're the ones that will sit and watch the 6 o'clock news or read the newspaper, and they'll just give a smirk and nod their head, and they'll get up and walk out, and they won't say anything. Even when they're pressed from other family members about why they disagree with something, they just won't let on, and that's the quiet cynic. And then also you've got the newbie. So a lot of these in the last 2 years have popped up because they disagree with the rhetoric that's been spewed out by governments and the media, and so they go searching for alternative information. And then once they go down the rabbit hole, there's all sorts of information that they find. Most of it's absolute garbage, and then they think that everything is a conspiracy. That's what we call the newbies. So now, has there been more conspiracy theorists, or has the news just used the term more? So over the last 18 months, in the newspapers, in mainstream media, which includes television news outlets, morning shows, and current affairs shows, the word conspiracy theorist has increased 1,670%. That word, the use of that word in the last 18 months in these shows. And the word neo-Nazi or far right wing has increased 3,000%. So the media's use of this word straight away prevents normal people that are trying to search for information from accepting information from someone that has been labelled far right wing, neo-Nazi, or conspiracy theorist. So to get that out of the way, I'm what you call someone that's seen patterns happen since 1996. And the next thing that we're going to touch on is the World Economic Forum. And believe it or not, that in the year 2000, the World Economic Forum was held in Melbourne. And we're going to run through some great stories about that very shortly once I turn off the freeway. Alright, so let's talk about the World Economic Forum. So, for those of you who don't know, before the World Economic Forum was held every year at Davos, they used to move around. And at Davos, they set up this mini city, which is basically cordoned off and no one can get in or out. But before that, they used to move around. And in the year 2000, September 9, 10, 11 and 12, in the year 2000, it was scheduled to be held at Melbourne in the Crown Entertainment Complex, or Crown Casino Complex. It's got the police up here, so I just got to slow down to 40 and get around them. Second. Right. Poor old dude. Gonna get a fine. So those of you who don't know, it was held there. Now, it was supposed to run for the 4 days, and all the delegates, all the big knobs from around the world, all the people that make decisions for you and your family, fly in and out. They were supposed to be there 2 days before, to have all their dinners and their get-togethers and, pat each other on the back for how good they are and all that sort of crap. But there's a guy who I was great friends with, and brilliant guy, and should be classed as a hero. He worked at Crown Casino, and he was able to defeat the US Secret Intelligence Service, ASIO, ASIS, the Federal Police, 4 international security agencies, the CID, Inside Crown, and the 2 Crown security agencies. He was able to defeat them. Now, he worked inside Crown as a technician, and he used the butt phone, and he dialed out by butting onto the chairman's phone line and the CAO and the CFO's phone line, and he was liaising with a lady from a local community radio station. I'm not sure which one it was, 3CBS back in the day or whatever it was. And that radio station obviously was, anti-government, and back in the day when socialists were actually socialists. And inside that radio station, they had a lot of organisations which were anti-government and anti-globalist organisations, and obviously the information got passed to them, and they were the ones that were organising the protest. So in the end, what happened was the delegate. So 2.25 days were cancelled because of how good the protests were arranged outside, which prevented the delegates from even getting into Crown. And obviously they knew that there was something not right. So each time they tried to bring delegates in, the protests were so well organised they couldn't get them in by car or by bus. And even when they organised dummy buses just full of random police officers, media personalities and whatnot, even when they tried to do that and pretend that these people were delegates, the protesters knew, so they didn't block the buses. They knew that they were going to try and bus the delegates in from another way, so they just let the buses drive in. So at that point in time, they knew that that there was something wrong. So the Victorian government at the time quickly established this legislation, sat overnight, established this legislation just for that particular period in time, for that week, where you couldn't, in the vicinity of Crown Casino, you couldn't stand and protest. So you couldn't gather, stand and protest. So that's where the term the moving protest comes. So I'm not sure if many of you younger people understand where that term come from. So what happened was then the protesters, instead of standing there, they would move around. Right. So they tried to get the the delegates in across the Yarra River on the second day, and it was about 60 knot breeze, and it was pissing down rain, and there was actually waves on the Yarra River, and these little police dinghy boats with the delegates were getting flooded, so they canned that idea. So the very next day, they took all the light towers off the Clark Street car park, literally all disconnected and pushed to one side all the light towers, and they flew each delegate in by helicopter, 3 at a time by helicopter. And after a day, they had all the delegates in, so they were able to have 1.5 days of delegation out of the forum. So whoever that guy was, he was a hero for doing that. Yeah, I'll just tell these little stories from time to time, so just to keep you interested. But more importantly, so what happens at the World Economic Forum? Now, because I worked there, I was lucky enough to see the agenda, and I was lucky enough to hear one whole day's deliberation, well, not deliberation, one whole day's hang on 1 second. Sorry about that, just got a phone call. So let's go back to Crown 2000 World Economic Forum. So at these forums, what they did do is they allowed locals to come and do presentations. So from memory, back then there was a young girl that came and gave a presentation on how young people should be more involved in politics. And there was another person that come and talked about local environment. There was a person that come and talk about philanthropy, and they do this to show the community that they, that they're open and they're letting people come and be a part of this this forum, and there's nothing hidden, there's no shenanigans going on. But after these people give their speeches, they usher them out. They're no longer part of the forum. So back then, 22 years ago, these are some of the topics that they covered. So they covered green cities, and I'll get into these in a minute. And they covered a topic called COC, which is harnessing social management from crisis. They talked about Bill Gates talked about the digital citizen. Now this is back 22 years ago, and there was another topic about financial resources through the BIR, and if you don't know what the BIR is, Bank of International Returns, I suggest that you go and look it up. And maybe if I have time, I'll touch on that a little bit further. So green cities. So green cities was a topic which most people have heard about now because it was the primary. It was a supplementary project which stemmed out of what we now know as the Agenda 2030. So basically what these people said is that they don't trust normal Western countries to govern themselves. So they don't trust us as the people to pick the right people to govern us. So what they do is they go right down to the local level and they start to implement their policies. And their policies, you'll see them now as you watch the news, and you've got climate crisis, you've got a pandemic crisis, you've got a war crisis. There's always a crisis, and people psychologically respond to crisis, and they also psychologically respond to all the information that comes from that crisis. And what people are looking for is they're looking for someone to resolve the crisis for them. And this was the talk that this particular gentleman gave about green cities. And he said, or they said, that the ideal structure is to have their ideological implementations done at the lowest particular level. So, for example, in Australia, that would be a local council. And they also talked about the structures are already in place. So it's not as if they need to go, it's not as if Klaus Schwab needs to go to Brisbane Council and he needs to sit there and give a speech and tell everyone how they should manage. They said the structures are already in place. So they said that both the left and right side of politics can operate this ideology separate from their existing ideologies. So you see there that both the left and right side of politics, both Labor and Liberal, in our instance in Australia, operate right down at the local level. And you would have heard through all the branch stacking information that was discussed, literally 12 months ago, that stacking happens right down at the lowest level. And if these people can always have either Liberal or Labor in charge, then it doesn't matter what semantics we get, such as which road is going to be built, or is there going to be a swimming pool here or not, or where we're going to dump the toxic soil. They're all the semantic information that we focus on, where the real global initiatives are being pushed through both parties secretly. People don't notice them. People don't focus on them because they're not a community issue. But what you'll see local councils signing up to green cities. You'll see local councils signing up to a particular international initiatives. And they do that, they bypass the political process when they do that, because local councils are a hybrid. Local councils are a hybrid of elected officials and an organised structure with a CEO. So that's just one aspect of what happened in the Economic Forum, and I think most people can honestly say that those policies of green cities, which included social reform, included wealth distribution, included the taking away of small business and redistributing activities to larger organisations for efficiency. These are all things that were in the green cities. In a minute, I'm going to talk about what Bill Gates said. Okay, so Bill Gates talked on a number of issues. One of the discussion topics that he had was the digital citizen, and in that he talked about how governments can be more efficient by allowing private organisations to manage civic records, such as your driver's license, birth certificate, passport, all your medical records. And the discussion went on so far as to say that the systems that would be set up would be able to be integrated across multiple governments, and that it would be more efficient for government to do this because obviously they're employing less people to undertake the applications and certifications, but also because it's in private hands, the government has the right to re-tender, and therefore the cost savings by making that process more efficient would be beneficial to government. So that was one of the topics he gave. Now this is 22 years ago, so this is where you can see I'm starting to show how the patterns start to piece together. Now, when I said before about the structure already in place, so the Liberal Labor Party are already in place, so the left and right, this is what people barrack for. So the terminology that the crisis management expert gave was that when there's a crisis, we side with comfort, or when we're upset, we side with comfort, or when things aren't going right, we side with comfort. So they know that that we feel like we've achieved something by changing government from time to time. They know that they're still going to implement everything that they need to do. It doesn't matter which government is in, because both governments in Australia, such as Liberal and Labor, or both sides of politics, are all of the understanding that by the signing of UniDroit and all these other treaties. We're obliged to undertake these, but they're not obliged to tell the public what they're actually doing. So then we move on to the crisis management. So this particular speech was the most interesting when you're looking at patterns. So in a crisis such as a cyclone or a flood, tsunami, volcano, earthquake, pandemic, people obtain their information from the media about the crisis, and they're looking for someone to resolve the crisis for them. So they're looking to reach out for someone to either explain the crisis or fix it, or to understand how to best psychologically manage the crisis. And he said although individuals resolve things differently, that as a pack, we all behave in a similar pattern. And he was talking about it's a civic obligation of everyone to manage a crisis. So, your neighbour will help you, and, the government will help you, and all this sort of stuff. And he says that's one aspect of management crisis. And then he says the other aspect is compounding the ideology in a crisis is the most efficient way to be able to push through structural change in society, because people are looking to resolve. So there is a problem, someone comes up with an answer, and then people resolve that answer by accepting it. So, for example, when people are hit multiple times by different, weather tragedies such as a flood or a drought, or so what happens is then you'll see it. They'll create climate crisis as the problem, and then the way to resolve it is you must accept this ideology about how we're going to fix the climate. So that's one object, and this is exactly what this person was saying at World Economic Forum 22 years ago. So amongst all the other issues that were talked about, this was all talked about in a day and a half, pretty much in a day and a half. So you can imagine what they get up to in 4 days, plus all the time where they're in private meetings and so forth. Now, at this forum, there was politicians from all walks of life. So we had we had federal and state politicians, we had local mayors, we had CEOs of councils, CEOs of corporations. They were all there, so they're all listening, and they're all understanding what these people are saying, and they're all understanding it's their job to push it. And if you ever get the opportunity to be able to do what I did and listen to some of these speeches, you'll understand that it's not subliminal. It's them telling each other what they have planned, and go out there and capitalise from what's going to happen. So one of the things that Bill Gates said was the online medical care, and basically he's saying to people, this is what's going to happen. Go out there and capitalise from it. So then what did we see? Literally 8-9 years later, we've seen a lot of startups that created online services such as Dial Into Doctor, and then obviously these people made a fortune during the pandemic, because literally no one could visit their doctor for a period of time in Victoria, at least, in many parts of the world. So there's just a little snippet of the World Economic Forum that happened in Melbourne in 22 years ago. And some of the things that they started to talk about then, and I wanted to highlight mainly the fact that they have said that in all the countries that they deal with, the WIF, which is all countries except for about 8 or 9, the structures are already in place. people will barrack for left-hand side, or they'll barrack for right-hand side, or if you're in the middle, you'll choose a side based upon your crisis circumstance, your personal circumstance, and you think that you've done the job because you've changed the government or you've made an impact in your vote. But for them, the people at the top who are implementing these policies, and we all know what they are if you're listening. Some people may agree with them, but the thing is, it's being done by stealth. And all you need to do is look at any piece of legislation that's presented, either federally or state. Look who is the person that executed the bill. So look at the presenter of the bill and look at the witness. Then look at the name of that person and the witness, and see what committees they're on, see who they visit, see where they've been, see what organisation that they used to work for, and you'll find that most of the bill presenters are either members of the WEF, they've been to Bilderberg meetings, they are on Council of Foreign Relations, they're in these groups, they're implementing these stealth policies. And these bills that are presented aren't from the will of the people. They're not Joe Blow, they're not your next door neighbour, they're not your football coach, they're not people that want these bills made law. But where are they coming from? They're coming from these institutions, and I hope that I just clarified how they do it by exposing some of what happened in the forum. So, all right, on to the next topic. Okay, we're nearly there. There's still a couple of things we need to cover off on just before we get to the Victorian election, which is the most important election in the history of the world, and why this is the most important video you'll watch. The reason why we need to cover off on certain things is to understand why the election is the most important election and your options at the election. Now, if you need to go and have a break, go and have a coffee or a beer or a glass of red wine or whatever, just pause the video and come back to it. But most importantly, you need to share this video to as many people as you can, because the election is in 2 weeks and pre-polling literally starts today. So, all right, so how do you know you're in a fascist dictatorship? Being in a fascist dictatorship is like being in love. You know it, you can feel it, but you just don't have the words to describe it. Mahua Moitra, who was a congresswoman, said that in her maiden speech, which I thought was quite good, because there's a lot of people out there that you speak to, know something isn't right, they can feel something isn't right, but they just don't want to lose trust in the system, they don't want to lose trust in the government, they don't want to lose trust in their religious organisation, because that would just be going too far for them, but they can just sense that there's something not right. A fascist dictatorship is a centralised autocratic government. Just got a phone call, hang on. Alright, so how do we know that we live in a fascist dictatorship? First of all, we need to understand what that actually means. So, fascist dictatorship is a centralised autocratic government. Autocratic meaning that they have one person that organises and structures the society, and it's seen as an efficient way to undertake tasks in society. And in an autocratic government, anyone that rejects the authority of the government or rejects any part of the system is outcast as an antisocial. Does that sound familiar? Now, Mahua Moitra, who was a US congresswoman who made the speech, says, how do you know you're in a fascist dictatorship? Well, it's a little bit like being in love. You know you're in it, you know you're part of it, but you just don't really have the words to describe it, which is, I thought was quite good explanation of the feeling. Because when you speak to people now out in the street, out and around, they might be traditional Labor or Liberal voters, or they never question the system, but all of a sudden they just feel that something's not quite right. There's something not quite right with society, and there's something a little bit sinister, and the way that the the people, the powers that be, resolve this is what they say is they said the new COVID normal. So they've already resolved in people's minds that there was a change and it was going to feel uneasy, but it's just the way it's going to be by saying it's the new normal. So what are the steps of a fascist dictatorship coming about, and why have a fascist dictatorship? Well, like I said before in the speech the COC speech from 22 years ago, in a time of crisis, you implement your ideology, and people generally will accept it because most of the time people are concerned about the community and they want to do the right thing by the community, and they don't want to step out of line, and they don't want to say anything that might upset people, so they just go along with the flow, right? And we'll get to the reason why they're doing it in Australia and Victoria just before we get to the election part. So there's three parts of our government, which is the legislative in a constitutional monarchy is the people that you elect. So the people that go represent you in Parliament and vote on particular kinds of legislation. Now, in this instance in Victoria, have we got control of legislation or legislative part of government? Tick, yes. Right. The second part is the executive. Now, the executive is in, say, a state level, is the governor and the ministers. They're the ones that get the bill enacted into law and handed over for management. Have we got control of them? Tick. So then we have the judiciary, which is magistrates and justices, and they're the ones that interpret the law. So when people are arrested for protesting or for rejecting the status quo, or fined, when they go to the lower level courts, such as a magistrate who is the gatekeeper, of course, they're going to get no remedy there. The only way they can get remedy is through a common law process, which again has even been taken away. The only way you can do that is by challenging the legislation at the High Court, and to get to the High Court from a like, for example, let's say someone was arrested with incitement to get people to go to a protest. By the time they get to the High Court, it costs that much money and has that much time. It has no impact on the current crisis. So all those people that are challenging that and doing it properly in the High Court will at some point get remedied. But in this system where the people in those positions are the same people that go to the WEF forums or go to the Bilderberg meetings, or like the chief of the Bar Association, they're all in on it. So there ain't no remedy that way. And then the other arm, it's not the arm of government, but the other most important arm is the enforcement, which is police officers who enforce the law, and the sheriffs who enact orders from made in court. And do we have them on board? Tick. Because the right to protest has been a common law right forever. The right to express your objection at the way that you're being treated is something that should never ever be taken away, and people know that. So what they did is they used the police to suppress any objection to the way the government were doing things. And is that one of the lines of what a fascist dictatorship is? Tick, we got that too. So as much as people don't like to hear this, because people are driving around going about their business and doing whatever, we are in a fascist dictatorship until the election that comes up. We are. It's plain and simple. And when you can construct control over all those arms through a crisis, then you've effectively done. You've effectively gone from a constitutional monarchy where people thought they had a free and fair government to a dictatorship. Right. So now let's get on to the reason why Australia and Victoria is important. So the history of Australia is quite a unique one. So Australia was well, the modern history of Australia is that it was ceded by the UK, and to help set up infrastructure and get resources, they changed the laws in the UK to really drop the line on misdemeanors, forcing people that had low-level crime to be sent for the term of their natural life, or for terms to Australia for hard labour. And the majority of these people were either working really poor working class English, or working class English, Welsh, Scots, Irish, and these people already were rebellious. So they were already rebellious against the system. They're already rebellious against the structures of society and the inequity of the feudal system. So they already had a rebellious tendency. So Australia was a rebellious country, and it was very hard to set up organisation in Australia if you pushed the people too hard. And you've seen that happen throughout the history of modern Australia. There's been loads of rebellions, loads of bush rangers, Rum Rebellion, Eureka Stockade, and even when Ned Kelly was arrested, tried and hung, there was a petition of 25,000 people at that time that wanted to annex part of central and western Victoria into its own colony. So the sentiment of rebellion in Australia was huge, up until the point where we were going to go into civil war around about the late 1800s, because the colonies, the governors of the colonies just pushed people too far, and it was about to crack. People couldn't trade across border, people couldn't run a business, there was a caste system, there was a lot of fraud, there was a lot of dictatorial management. Does it sound familiar? So what happens is Quick and Garron went out and they did that constitutional convention where they basically visited every single town in Australia, and they got people's thoughts and ideas, and then eventually we federated. And if you get the annotated copy of the Australian Constitution, or the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act, you'll see all the annotations from all those meetings in there, or references to be able to get them. Very interesting reading. But the point is, the reason why they want to push hard in Australia is because it sets the scene for the whole world. They want to see how far that they can push people. They want to know if they're going to introduce something, if they're going to force something upon the people of Australia, especially Victoria, that they don't want to take or they don't want to do. They want to know what sort of pushback they're going to get. They want to know how people are going to respond to the information, how they're going to reject it, what links they're going to go to rebel. They want to know. They need this information because they use this as data for their future rollouts. And what better than a medical crisis to be able to confuse people, because the person giving the directives isn't the person they want to focus their anger at, it's somebody else. And when they go and visit their health professionals repeating the same thing, but still there's a sense that things aren't quite right. So the reason why they forced this fascist dictatorship was to implement what they needed to implement and to see how the people of Australia, and especially Victoria, responded. So, got that out of the way. Now, in Australia, the rebellious nature pre-Federation was usually violent. After Federation, it's not as if we lost our rebellious nature. The nature just transformed into organised movements such as union movements, community movements, social movements, and there was the idea of withdrawing your labour. Taking yourself away from that particular part of society until there was some kind of remedy, or until the other party wanted to negotiate. And that history has been brought to Australia for that history of withdrawing labour and withdrawing yourself from those particular systems is an ancient history. But in modern history, most people would have known the term boycott. Like, I'm going to boycott that. But all you need to do is do a Google search on boycott and see. In Ireland, we had the feudal system that was in place there, where you would have a landowner, and the original people there would pay rent to the landowner for the right to produce, to keep their family, and in return they would produce crops and sell it to pay their rent to the landlord. So in that boycott's case, he was such a prick that people stopped, that withdrew their labour, stopped selling items, and stopped maintaining his fields, and they got remedy because they made an impact on that person. And the same if you look up the matchstick workers in the UK, 1888, the same there. Their conditions were horrible, terrible, and it was an organised labour movement that eventually wore down the safety issues and the inhumane issues, and somewhat rectified it. So that's the history that's a history that we had in Australia. We had that mentality in Australia. So that's it for the fascist dictatorship. So now that we've been talking about unions, so we used to then voice. The circuit breaker used to be social movements. That's what our circuit breaker was. Now, it didn't matter who was in government, whether it was Labor or Liberal, or if you had a dispute with your employer or with a global organisation, you had the right to withdraw your labour, or you had a right not to represent yourself, right to take your representation away from that particular organisation until you had remedy. And the only way you could do that was collectively, right? And that's why the union movement have, one in, all in, touch one, touch all. That's where that terminology comes from. Because there's no point 5 or 6 people walking out and then 100 people keep working. It has to be a collective arrangement. Now, so you think to yourself, okay, so in a system where there's sinister forces coming down on our state or in our country, and we've gone into a dictatorial government, then we'll rely on our unions. Okay, so our circuit breaker will be unions. We'll go to them and say, look, something's not right, we just need time. And then what happened in Victoria? All right, this is where you know that every single organisation has been injected with the same agenda. Because what happens with CFMEU and our old mate John Setka, right? When the construction mandate was brought about, a lot of people were happy because they thought, you know what, if construction workers are touched, well, shit's going to hit the fan and the whole country will stop. So we heard nothing from John Setka when they introduced the mandate. Nothing. He didn't come out and speak to his guys at sites. He didn't allow them to speak up, and So what happened was people dropped the tools and they go to his office and they say, mate, we need to speak to you. And he doesn't come out. He doesn't speak to him. Instead, he tries to organise with his homo bikie mates, tries to organise an escape from the place, but it was completely surrounded. So in the end, he has to come out. And what does he do? He offers no remedy. He offers no solidarity. He offers no historical, social solidarity he basically just destroyed the whole idea of the union movement with what he said, that his hands were tied. Now, if his representatives were happy to go out with a fight, he should have been standing behind him, not saying, oh, well, you know, I didn't create the COVID and the government is doing what they're doing. No, he should have turned around and he should have faced with his workmates and he should have marched to the death. And that's the whole idea of solidarity. And this joker, Setka, and it wouldn't be a video of mine without kicking him in the guts, he doesn't speak to anyone for a couple of days. He goes into his hiding, probably down at Daniel Andrews' holiday place in Mornington. And then he comes on the radio, right? And he says that there was a small percentage of right-wing neo-Nazis. Now, after what we've been through in this video, you understand that those words in his mouth were planted there by someone. He was given a script to discredit his own people, because he wouldn't have had the brains to come up with something like that, so it was obviously given to him to say. So now we're at the point where we have no remedy, alright? And it's going to get worse. So stand by, it's going to get worse before it gets better. Okay, so just a sidestep before we get to the bad stuff, and then we're going to finish off with the good stuff. So we all know that our system of government is a representative system. We have the opportunity to elect someone, and then we go on to then they go on to Parliament and they represent the constituents of their particular area that they were elected in. Now, what's happened to that system is that instead of the elected representatives instead of the constituents being the most important part of that process, the party has become the most important part of that process. So if I was a member of the Greens, if I was a member of the Labor, if I was a member of Liberal, generally you're elected. So let's say, for example, the Greens, you're elected in that area that you're elected in because generally the majority of people have a similar ideology to you, or they accept your ideology, right? I think everyone would agree with that. But that doesn't give them a license to go in and vote on every single particular topic without consulting their constituents, right? So it doesn't give them a mandate just because they're elected to go ahead and just vote on anything they like without consulting their constituents. There must always be a process in which they consult with their constituents because for example, let's say, for example, take the Green side of things. If the member of Melbourne, I think is a Greens, I'm quite sure, goes in. Let's say, the member of Melbourne goes in, and they were presented with a topic where let's say the Western Freeway was going to be extended out near Ararat, and there was two options. One option was cost a little bit more, and it went because it went around a little bit more, and there was another option where it cost a little bit less, but it would destroy a whole segment of ancient original culture. I'm almost certain that the majority of people that voted for in Melbourne that voted for that Greens member would reject the destruction of original history, up to 1,500 years of original history. So what right has that person got to vote yes for that when he knows or she knows very well that her constituents would reject it? And that's the point I'm trying to make. Now, we are a very, very lazy democratic nation. We go to the polls. Most people do donkey votes, or most people draw a penis, or most people write Jesus and tick Jesus. We are a very lazy democracy. We have no idea about the impact of what elections are having, and that's where we're going to get to. Now, not since Federation has so many people being activated and actively participating with their local members in the last 2 years. And this is what should happen all the time, not just when there's a crisis. You need to be on the front foot, people, not on the back foot when the globalists have already implemented their agenda and then you're responding to the crisis. You need to be on the front foot. So what happened was, all electorates, every single one, upper house and lower house in Victoria, there was so much correspondence to each of the elected representatives, more correspondence than there has been since Federation. So we're talking, 120 years. More correspondence since Federation. And not just more correspondence, people actively rejecting the government's plans for segregation, the government's plans for mandates, the government's plans for pandemic legislation. It was the obligation for those elected members to vote the way that their constituents told them to vote, but they didn't. So they all committed a fraud. But why did they vote that way? Because you're not the most important person in this process where you should be at the top. You're at the bottom. They elected the way that their party told them to elect. And who told the party to introduce that particular legislation in the first place? Well, you all know who did now after watching this video. So that's just a sidestep. Right, let's get into the next topic. Right, so what happens when all remedies are exhausted? So people are sensing that something's not quite right. People aren't liking the way that the government are going about things. People are got an instinct that something's not quite right. People are understanding that the police didn't act like police. People are understanding that their elected representatives didn't do the right thing by them when they actually asked them to do certain things. And people are understanding that there's no remedy in the court system. And then for the for the working class, for the people that are members of unions or associations. Sorry, I'll take that back. Not the working class. All associations, including working class unions and associations such as medical associations, I've got to point that out, have let people down and offered no remedy other than they got to persist in the agenda that's been set aside. What happens is then people then fall back on an election. So we have an election coming up, and there has been more individuals put up their hand to serve, more parties, more centralised parties, and more parties opposing globalist agenda than we've ever seen before in the history of Victoria. Now that shows you that a lot of people are feeling the same way as most of the people out there, that something just ain't right and there's some kind of a change that needs to happen. But unfortunately, some of those parties are set up and have got names attached to them where people that are so angry and so disillusioned with the system or the government that they chose, they're going to pick the name of this particular party or person, thinking that they're, rejecting the situation. And we'll get into that in a minute. All right, so this is the worst news, right? So the powers that be that have already envisaged this, so they knew that by creating a dictatorship, taking away all particular kinds of remedy, taking away your ability for your unions to work for you, or your association to work for you, that people were going to reject the people serving them in an election. So they've already got in place a system where they make sure that this two-party system stays in place. And this person in Australia is a political savant by the name of Glenn Drury. Now, what Glenn does is he has a mathematical process to work out how the preferences in each electorate, upper house and lower house, are going to pan out based upon his it's obviously a very good system that he has. That's why they call him the savant. And he will work out who will be elected and by what percentage. He will also work out the percentage of people that will vote for a certain person based upon the traditional voting methods, the way that the lazy Australians have voted previously. Well, we need to change this, and we'll get to that in a minute. Now, this Glenn Drury guy, he's a stockbroker for the election. If you want if you want him to pick your preferences for you, then you pay him a sum of money, and he'll do it. Now, if you're a party and you pay him so much money, he'll do it in a way where he'll pretty much guarantee you a spot in Parliament, right? So, for example, if you're an independent or if you're a really small party and you've got shitloads of money and you go to him and say, I'm just having a guess here, say with $150,000 and say, mate, I need to get in to Parliament, so help me out. Or, on the other hand, if you were someone that somebody else needed you in Parliament for, well then maybe they would foot the bill for you to give to Glenn, so they make sure that you get into Parliament. And this is where preferences are really, really important. Now, this is the real bad part of politics in Australia. Now, I can't say that elections are rigged. They're not. Elections aren't rigged whatsoever. What Glenn is doing is perfectly lawful. Perfectly legal, sorry, not lawful. Perfectly legal in our current system. He's allowed to do this, parties are allowed to do this. So when you go and vote, you have to think very carefully about the party that you're voting for. Now, if you're doing a rejection vote, let's say you're, just for example, again, I'm not telling anyone how to vote. Let's say, for example, you're a Labor voter and you're disgusted with what's happened. Or you're a Liberal voter and you're unhappy with what the Liberal Party have offered the last 3 or 4 years, so you want to, change your vote to maybe central moderate, or your Labor Party, you don't want to go right, you want to pick someone in the centre, maybe centre left. You've got to understand where that preference is going to get you, because there's no point voting if it's going to end up back in the Labor Party, and we'll get to that in a minute. And Glenn's job is to make sure that the Liberal or Labor Party get into power. Now, Glenn doesn't care whether they have a majority. It's his job. The powers that be want him to make sure that either one of these parties get in. It's the media's job to promote these two parties and pretend that there's no one else running. That's the media's job, and they do that quite well. And it's also the media's job to make you think that you're voting for a team or voting for a personality. What you've got to remember is you live in an area. So for me, I'm in Western Melbourne. So my local community has different aspects, different organics than, say, something out in the east. So when I choose my member, I will ring every single candidate and I'll interview them like they're going for a job. And that's what people need to do. You need to exercise the right to vote that you have, which has been given to you. And if you don't exercise it properly, like we've been doing for the last 120 years, we end up with foreign infiltration where our elections are being legally manipulated. So in the end, you don't really choose, they choose. So that's Glenn Drury out the way, and that's the legal manipulation of elections out the way, because I can't say rigged, because it's not rigged. rigged would mean there would be some impropriety happening. This not be moral, but it's definitely legal. And I think Victorians and Australians need to know this, because this guy works all over Australia and New Zealand. So now let's get to the part, the nitty gritty. And I'm sorry it's taking this long, but I need to expose everything out there and the reason why we're doing what we're doing. We need to put a handbrake on foreign infiltration. And the only way to put a handbrake on foreign infiltration is to take away the power of the absolute left and the absolute right. Now, the absolute left, you know who I'm talking about. And the absolute right, you know who I'm talking about. Because the majority of people who vote absolute left or right, it ends up going to the left and right moderates, which is the Liberal and Labor Party. So this year it's looking like both their primary votes are going to be down. So here's what we do. Of course, if you want to vote Liberal and Labor, it's up to you. But if you want to stop the foreign infiltration, put a handbrake on it, force them to restructure what they're doing in Australia and Victoria for the next 3 years at least, to allow us to exercise our proper democratic process by liaising with our elected members constantly, weekly, monthly, which we don't do, then this is what we need to do. So it's going to go through the parties, which I'm going to pull over to do this. So I'm going to pull over in 1 second. Okay, so there's 24 parties registered in Victoria at the moment, and I think 23 of these will be running in the Victorian state election. So I'm going to go through each and every single one of them, and at the end of this I'm going to give you some of the sample ballot papers for the lower house and the upper house. Now in Victoria, the Legislative Assembly is the lower house and the Legislative Council is the upper house, and I think it works out that one Legislative Council member for every 8 Legislative Assembly members. Legislative Council members are the most important members because they're the gatekeepers for legislation coming through. Generally, obviously, over the last 3 years, you've probably noticed that hasn't been quite the case because of the foreign manipulation and interference, as we've just talked about. So we have the Victorian Socialists. Now, back in my day, socialists used to be pro-family. They used to have organisational structures that were good. They represented everyone, including families, people of all genders, races, religions, and of all ideologies. That was the whole idea of socialism. Now, the Victorian Socialists are just very unhappy young people who are upset with their parents for not being aborted. Then we have the Transport Party, which is Rod Barton's party. Now, we all know what Rod Barton did. There's really no explanation for that. Then we have the Greens. Now, the Greens are a little bit less vicious than the Victorian Socialists. They're happy that they were born, but they're just unhappy that everyone else wasn't aborted. The Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party, Restored Democracy, One Nation, and whatever ideology you have about One Nation, whether you think they're racist or whatever, I think what you need to do is go back and actually listen to their policies and see what the amount of work that Malcolm Roberts has done in Senate committees for liberty and making sure that both the major parties are doing the right thing. Again, I'm not promoting anyone. Right, then we have New Democrats, the Nationals, the Liberals, and the way you know that the two-party system has been infiltrated is that how many opportunities did Matthew Guy have to literally gut Daniel Andrews? But he has been more silent than anyone. So be very interesting when their preferences come out. I wouldn't be surprised if their preferences were enabling Labor to get back in. That's just my opinion. Again, my patented opinion. Then we have legalised cannabis. We have the Health Australia Party, the Freedom Party, and the Freedom Party obviously were born out of a number of individuals that ran at the federal election, or that were harmed or disagreed with the current status quo, and a few of them obviously are anti-globalists, a few of them anti-Labor, anti-Liberal, a few of them again, you'd have to look into who your particular representative is, and we'll get into that in a minute. But then we have the Reason Party. I think everyone should put a T in front of that. Then we have Family First. We have Hinch. I'm surprised that guy's still alive. We have the Democratic Labor Party, which, for those of you who like their political history, Rob Santamaria, he was a Labor member back in the 50s who tried to eliminate the incursion of communism into the Labor Party. Wow. So he was a very, very popular person, and I think he was the one that started the DLP. So then we have the Companions and Pets Party. Then we have the Australian Labor Party, and we have the Animal Justice Party, who love animals but hate humans, and they have the Angry Victorians Party. And there's one other party which I missed on my list, but it's the Sack Daniel Andrews Party. And like I said before, be very careful about the names of some of these parties, because they are designed to capture particular feelings at this election, and that's the reason why I'm doing this video. Now, how do you stop global influence at election? How do you put the handbrake on? And how do you set these people back possibly 5 or 10 years from their agenda? Maybe longer if people eventually wake up after this video. So what you first need to do is you need to ring your local member for each one of these parties. Local member, assembly member, so lower house member and upper house member if they have one. Now in your area you may not have all 24 of these parties. You may have, on your lower house sheet you may have 5 or 6. The upper house sheet you might have in the lower house sheet you might have 5 or 6, and we'll get to the upper house sheet soon. So you have to ring every single one of these members that are representing you, and you have to interview them like you're employing them for a job, because you are. You're employing them to represent your thoughts, your feelings, your interpretations, your ideology, and you have to express that to them. Every single bill that's passed, you have to express it to them. You have to get their feedback from them. Why did they vote a certain way? Why did they vote on that? Can you provide information on how many people told you not to vote for that as compared to how many people did? They must provide this information to you. But we don't ask for that because we've left it too late. But anyway, we can fix it. Now, ringing around everyone. One question that you must ask, which has got to be the first question that you ask them. Did your party use Glenjury to set up your VPC, your voter preference card? Did your party employ Glenjury to set up your VPC? That's the first thing that you ask them. Because if they did, they're not interested in your vote. They're just interested in getting one of their elected members into Parliament. That's the first question. Now, that will leave out a lot of people on your card, right? That will leave out a lot of people on your cards. And what you want to focus on is the people that didn't engage in Glenjury preparing their VPC, but you want to engage on the people that have been open and honest about how they created their own VPC and the reasons why. Now, you might have your own particular ideology and it might align with someone. That's great. You can vote for them. You can vote for whoever you want. But the most important thing, and what I'm going to do after I finish talking here, I'm going to put a picture of a lower house ballot and an upper house ballot, so you can see what they look like. The upper house ballot is quite, it's going to be quite complex this year, just because the amount of parties and individuals that are running. So this is the amount of parties. So there's loads of independents as well that are going to be running, and you should interview the independents. Sometimes independents, if you speak to them, have some great ideas. They have some great input. They will more than likely reject government influence, but again, you have to interview them. All right, so you're going to give your vote away. Your vote is your vote. You know how you feel. You know how you feel about the world. You know how you feel about the environment. You know how you feel about work. You know how you feel about the happenings in your community and the world. That's your vote. So you've got to pick the person that you think is going to best align with your vote. And when it comes to all the differing bills and processes in Parliament, you're going to want them to be able to vote for the majority of their constituents. And that's another question you need to ask. Are you going to be voting for your party? Are you going to be voting for your conscience? Or are you going to be voting how your constituents feel? Because you might have a religious person that has been elected that opposes, let's say opposes abortion. Let's say, for example. Now, I oppose abortion for my own reasons, but if they oppose if they oppose abortion, and they have to, and the majority of their constituents say no, well, we feel that late-term abortion should be allowed, or under certain circumstances abortion should be allowed. So let's say the overwhelming majority of their constituents say, then that person should not be allowed to vote on their conscience. They should have to vote for the way their constituents told them to vote, and that's the line of your questioning has to be along those lines. The constituents are the most important thing in a democratic process. If you ignore your constituents, you don't have a democracy. So your lower house card, you have to number all numbers, right? So all boxes have to be numbered 1 through to however many people have been representing you. And I know a lot of people just have to go there and they have to do it because they're not really interested in politics and whatnot. But if you're going to do a donkey vote, which is the majority of people, they'll just do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 down in a line. This year, do a donkey vote in reverse. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Do it upwards instead of downwards. Please just do that, because even though they say that the ballot card is done by ballot, I'm very skeptical about that whole process, especially when you look at the Parliament ballot. But anyway, please, if you're going to do a donkey vote, do it in reverse. Mix it up, spice your life up a little bit. Do it in reverse. Now, when it comes to the upper house card, this is the most important thing, right? For lazy people, you're going to have a line, the boxes across the top. The boxes across the top represent the party. So whoever is the first ticket person in that party in your electorate will get the vote when you tick that box, right? So they'll get the vote. So if you tick 1 for Labor Party, whoever is representing the Labor Party in that area will get that vote. If you tick, and this is where it starts to get important, if you tick, say, 1 for the Freedom Party, right? That vote will go towards the first ticketed person for the Freedom Party in your electorate. But voting above the line then falls back on the VPCs. And this is where it becomes very interesting. So, if you don't exercise your right to choose your preferences, which you completely are allowed to do. So, when you walk into a booth and, if you're sort of, say, Green leaning or Victorian Socialist, or, maybe if you're a Liberal Democratic Party leaning or whatever, they'll give you their How to Vote card, which is basically their VPC ticket. And a lot of people will go in and they'll just, say in a lower house, they'll just go, they'll follow that same sequence. You don't have to. You can choose your own preferences. If you like the local Liberal Democratic member because he was the best person you interviewed, right? And Liberal Democratic Party preference, let's say, I don't know who they're going to preference. Let's say they preference the Shooters and Shooters Party next, but you didn't like that guy as a complete tosser. You don't have to put 2. You can put 2 for whoever you want, and that's where the preference will be directed. You direct the preference. But in the upper house, in the council, if you vote above the line, then it's Glenn Drury's preferences that start to fall into line. So what will happen is, let's say there's you go in there and you vote one for Freedom Party. Now, Freedom Party, I don't know what they've done as far as Glenjury or not, but let's say they have engaged Glenjury, or they might not have. You'll find that out by asking them. That's what you got to do. If you vote 1 and then walk out, it's most likely that the Freedom Party aren't going to get enough votes. They aren't going to get any more votes than Liberal or Labor, because most people are brainwashed into voting for those two. So what will happen is, let's say the big majority of the Freedom Party votes are there, and they voted 1, they'll go down the line. So the supervisor in the counting, they'll go down the line, right, in the preferences, and they'll end up with the first major party that pops up. That's what they'll do, right? That's generally the way that their VPC cards work, right? But if they have a high number of votes, if they have a high number of votes under the card, then that's different, because then they have to shuffle the preferences as each individual person is eliminated from the vote count. So if you don't know, what happens is, if you vote below, they'll put all the first votes, right? The person with the least amount of votes the votes go to the next person, and so on and so on. But if you vote above the line, it refers back to the VPC card, which has been handed to the Electoral Commission, and and those cards are with the supervisors, so they'll see which way the preferences should be divided. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong by the vote counters. I'm not saying anything's rigged, but generally the media want an answer by 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock at night. So generally the lower parties, their shuffles are just basically put into, let's say for example, Freedom Party's, just going to focus on Freedom Party. Let's say Freedom Party's got Liberals as their first preference. Their supervisor most likely, for efficiency, will just pick up their pile and put in Liberal. They won't bother about the shuffle, because they just know roughly what's going to happen. And if you're going to vote, please vote below the line, and please vote 1 to 5 minimum, because if you don't vote 1 to 5, it'll be an informal vote. Informal votes will just go to the standing candidate. So 1 to 5 minimum. If you can, fill them all in. You make sure that you decide where your preference goes. So if you hate both the Liberal and Labor Party, when you vote below the line, put them dead last and fill every single box in. It's only going to take 5 minutes of your life to do this, right? Or you get to explain to your kids and grandkids why the once great nation of Australia is a complete tragedy if it goes the way it's going. And so if anyone needs any more explanation, inbox me or send me an email. But what we've done is try to explain to you how to defeat the international interference in our personal lives. Again, just going over this. Upper House, most important, Legislative Council, please don't vote above the line. Please vote below the line. If you want to make a difference in this state, even if you love the Liberals or Labors, even if you love them, maybe just give them a timeout. 3-year timeout, 4-year timeout. Let them understand that the population will never ever put up with what they gave us for the last 3 years. Never. Right? Let the people behind the scenes, them who are controlling all this, understand that we are still a rebellious nation. We've still got a bit of cunning in us. And that we're not going to put up with this shit. And it's time to give Liberal and Labor a timeout. And it's time for you to actually fucking do your civil duty. A little bit of work interviewing people and a little bit of thought going into your voting, because when you don't do your civil duty, that's when psychopathic, socialistic people that have been elected come and take away your civil duty. Anyway, have a nice day.